The city never sleeps, and tonight was no exception. The streets glittered under the glow of streetlights as cars rushed past, each carrying its own story. Among them was Zara, a young woman with dreams larger than her circumstances. Her second-hand bicycle wobbled slightly as she weaved through traffic, her mind racing faster than her wheels. She had just finished her third job of the day, delivering food for a local cafe, and the exhaustion showed in the slump of her shoulders. But Zara wasn't one to complain. Life had taught her that persistence was her greatest weapon against the odds. At the other end of town, a sleek black sports car rolled out of a towering skyscraper's underground parking lot. Behind the wheel was Arian Malik, the city's youngest and most sought-after CEO. His tailored suit, sharp jawline, and piercing gaze made him the kind of man who turned heads wherever he went. But despite his seemingly perfect life, Arian carried an air of detachment, as though the world outside his tinted windows rarely touched him. Tonight, however, something was different. His grip on the steering wheel tightened as he replayed the harsh words from a boardroom meeting earlier that day. Even CEOs, it seemed, had battles to fight. As Zara pedaled through the bustling streets, her thoughts drifted to her younger brother. He needed new textbooks for school, but their savings had run dry. A pang of guilt hit her. She promised him she'd figure something out. Zara's focus faltered for just a moment, her eyes catching on the reflection of a jewelry store window as she imagined a life where her family didn't have to struggle for every meal. That split second was all it took. A sudden screech of tires pierced the air. Zara turned her head, but it was too late. Her bicycle collided with the glossy black car that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Time slowed as she was thrown onto the pavement, the sharp sting of pain shooting through her arm. The impact wasn't serious, but it was enough to send her heart pounding. Her bike lay crumpled next to her, a symbol of her fragile reality shattered in an instant. Arian slammed on the brakes, his heart skipping a beat as he stepped out of the car. His usual calm demeanor cracked as he approached the girl sprawled on the ground. He wasn't worried about the car. It could be fixed. But the sight of Zara, her wide, terrified eyes glancing up at him, struck a chord he didn't expect. For a moment, their worlds collided in silence. "I'm so sorry. I didn't see," Zara stammered, her voice trembling as she scrambled to her feet. The scrape on her elbow was bleeding, but she tried to hide it, more concerned with the furious-looking man standing before her. She could barely bring herself to meet his eyes, which held an intensity she couldn't quite place. Arian glanced at the damage to his car, then back at the girl. He expected anger to rise, but instead, he found himself focused on her trembling hands and the way she clutched her bag as though bracing for the worst. She looked so out of place. Vulnerable yet defiant, like she was ready to fight back even if she didn't have the strength. "You're hurt," Arian said, his voice steady but softer than he intended. Zara blinked, surprised by his tone. She had expected shouting, threats, maybe even the police. But concern, that was unexpected. "I'm fine," she insisted, brushing off her scraped elbow as if it didn't matter. Her pride wouldn't allow her to accept pity, not from a man like him. But when her knees wobbled slightly, Arian instinctively reached out to steady her, his touch firm yet gentle. "What's your name?" he asked, his gaze locking onto hers. "Zara," she replied hesitantly, wondering why this stranger, this impossibly wealthy man, cared to know. She had no idea that her simple answer would set the stage for a series of events that would change both their lives forever. Before either of them could say another word, a crowd began to gather, their whispers growing louder. The tension thickened as Zara's cheeks burned with embarrassment. She didn't belong in this part of town, let alone at the center of such attention. And yet, as Arian glanced at the crowd, his protective instincts kicked in. "Let's talk somewhere else," he said firmly, gesturing toward his car. Zara froze, her mind screaming at her to refuse. She didn't trust him, or anyone, for that matter. But the sincerity in his voice made her pause. Before she could decide, the sound of approaching sirens broke through the noise, drawing closer with every second. Zara's heart sank. The police. This was her worst nightmare. Would they blame her for the accident? Would they demand money she didn't have? Panic gripped her chest as she weighed her options, none of them good. And yet, Arian stood there, calm and unshaken, as though he could fix everything with a single word. What neither of them knew was that this chance encounter, born from chaos and bad luck, was just the beginning. The threads of their lives had intertwined in a way neither could undo, and the decisions they were about to make would spark a story that no one, least of all them, could have anticipated. The police sirens grew louder, and Zara's pulse raced. Her instinct screamed at her to run, but she was frozen in place, unsure of what to do. Arian noticed her unease and stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Get in the car," he said firmly, but not unkindly. "I'll handle this." Zara's hesitation was palpable. Every fiber of her being told her not to trust a stranger, especially one whose world was so far removed from hers. But something in his calm demeanor, the way he seemed to take control of the situation without panic or anger, made her nod reluctantly. She clutched her torn bag and followed him, her head bowed as murmurs from the gathering crowd buzzed in her ears. The car's interior was as intimidating as the man himself. Sleek leather seats, a faint scent of luxury, and a dashboard that looked more advanced than anything Zara had ever seen. She sank into the seat, suddenly hyper-aware of her scraped hands and dirt-streaked clothes. This wasn't her world, and she didn't belong here. Arian slid into the driver's seat and glanced over at her. "You don't have to worry about the police," he said as he pulled the car smoothly back into traffic. His voice was steady, reassuring. "It was an accident. I'll make sure they don't trouble you." Zara nodded, still unsure why he was being so kind. "I'll pay for the damage," she blurted out, though the words felt hollow even as she said them. She couldn't afford to fix his car, not even a scratch. Arian's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. "You don't need to worry about that," he replied. "What's more important is making sure you're okay." For a moment, silence filled the car, broken only by the hum of the engine. Zara stared out the window, her mind racing. Why was he helping her? People like him didn't usually notice people like her, let alone go out of their way to help. She wanted to ask him, but didn't dare. Instead, she pressed her hands together, trying to steady herself. The car pulled up to a private clinic, its bright sign cutting through the night. Zara shook her head quickly. "I don't need to see a doctor," she protested, her voice firmer now. "It's just a scrape. I'll be fine." Arian turned to her, his gaze unwavering. "You might think it's nothing, but it's better to make sure. Trust me." Those last two words caught her off guard. Trust him? She barely knew him. And yet there was something in his eyes, an honesty that made her nod, even as doubt gnawed at her. Inside the clinic, a nurse cleaned Zora's scrape while Arian made arrangements at the front desk. She watched him out of the corner of her eye, wondering what kind of person he really was. He seemed polite, almost distant, as though he was used to handling situations like this with cool efficiency. And yet there was a warmth in his actions that didn't match the stoic image he projected. Afterward, Arian offered to drop Zara home. She hesitated again, torn between accepting his help and keeping her pride intact. But the thought of walking home in the dead of night, with a broken bike and aching legs, made her nod reluctantly. As they drove through the narrow streets of her neighborhood, Zara felt the weight of their differences more than ever. The towering skyscrapers and polished streets of his world felt like a dream compared to the dimly lit alleys and crumbling buildings of hers. She hoped he wouldn't judge her for where she came from. "This is me," she said quietly when they reached her apartment building. It wasn't much, a rundown structure with peeling paint and a flickering light by the entrance. Zara felt a pang of embarrassment, but quickly pushed it aside. She wasn't ashamed of her life, even if it was far from perfect. Arian glanced at the building, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," Zara added, clutching her bag tightly as she opened the car door. "For everything." He nodded, his usual composure intact. "Take care of yourself, Zara." As the car disappeared into the night, Zara stood there for a moment, unsure of how to process the evening. Part of her wanted to forget it ever happened, to move on and focus on the challenges that awaited her. But another part, a quieter, more vulnerable part, couldn't help but wonder if she'd ever see him again. Meanwhile, Arian couldn't shake the encounter from his mind. As he drove back to his penthouse, he replayed the moment their eyes met after the accident. There was something about her resilience, her honesty, that intrigued him. He had spent his life surrounded by people who only cared about his wealth or status. But Zara was different. She wasn't afraid to speak her mind, even in the face of adversity. Over the next few days, their lives continued in parallel, each grappling with their own struggles. Zara worked tirelessly, juggling her jobs while trying to save enough for her brother's school fees. Arian buried himself in meetings and deadlines, his mind distracted by thoughts of the girl who had crashed into his car. Fate, however, wasn't done with them yet. One evening, as Zara hurried through the city delivering orders, she spotted a familiar figure stepping out of a cafe. Her heart skipped a beat. It was Arian, his sharp suit and confident stride unmistakable. He didn't see her, but Zara couldn't help but linger for a moment, torn between slipping away unnoticed and approaching him. Before she could decide, Arian turned his head, and their eyes met. Time seemed to freeze as they stared at each other, both caught off guard. Zara's mind raced. Should she say something? Apologize again? Thank him? But before she could speak, Arian took a step closer, his expression softening. "Zara," he said, his voice carrying an unexpected warmth. "What are you doing here?" And just like that, their worlds collided once more, setting the stage for a connection that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. Zara blinked in surprise, her breath catching in her throat as she stood frozen in the middle of the sidewalk. Arian had walked up to her, his presence undeniable. She had expected to go unnoticed, to pass him by like two strangers in a busy city. But here he was, standing in front of her with a look that made her feel like the world had narrowed down to just the two of them. I didn't expect to see you here," Zara stammered, shifting uncomfortably. She wasn't sure why, but her heart was pounding, and her palms were suddenly clammy. She never imagined running into him again, especially not after everything that had happened. Arian studied her with a faint smile, his eyes softening as he took in her nervousness. "I never expected to see you again, either," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. The weight of his words made Zara pause. There was a sincerity in his voice that made it impossible to ignore. "I've been meaning to thank you for the other day," she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "You didn't have to help me. I wasn't expecting." "Zara," he interrupted gently, raising a hand as if to stop her words. "I've been thinking about you a lot since that night." She blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" "The way you are, your strength, your determination, how you just kept going despite everything." Arian's voice dropped, and there was something about his words that caught Zara off guard. She had never been the kind of person anyone would stop to think about, let alone a CEO with his whole life in front of him. Zara's heart pounded harder. "I'm just trying to survive," she replied quietly. "I'm not looking for a charity case or anything." "I don't see you as a charity case," Arian said, his tone steady. "I see someone who's been through a lot and keeps going. I respect that." Zara felt her chest tighten. She had no idea how to respond. Her mind raced, replaying the past few days, the unexpected kindness he had shown her, and the way he seemed so different from anyone she had ever met. The thought that someone like him, who could have anything he wanted, could see value in her was overwhelming. "Why are you telling me this?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I want to know more about you, Zara," Arian said, his eyes sincere and steady. "I want to understand what drives you." Zara took a deep breath, her emotions a whirlwind. She had always kept her guard up, never letting anyone too close. People like Arian didn't belong in her world, and yet there was something about the way he looked at her now, something that felt real. "I don't know if I belong in your world," she said softly, almost to herself. "I don't have much to offer, just a lot of struggle." Arian stepped closer, closing the gap between them. His voice was calm, but there was a new intensity in it. "I don't want your struggle, Zara. I want **you**." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Zara didn't know what to make of them. She had never been asked for anything more than what she could give in terms of work or survival. But Arian was asking for something different. He was asking to know her, to connect in a way that no one ever had before. The world she had built to protect herself from disappointment was crumbling with every second she stood in front of him. For the first time in a long while, Zara allowed herself to think about what it might be like to let someone in, to trust someone beyond the confines of her world. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. She wasn't sure if she was ready for this change, for the uncertainty of what might come next, but she knew that this wasn't just an accident anymore. This was something that was meant to be. "I don't know if I'm ready for all of this," she admitted, her voice shaky but honest. Arian smiled gently, the kind of smile that made Zara feel like maybe, just maybe, everything could be okay. "You don't have to be ready, Zara. We take it one step at a time." As the words hung between them, Zara realized that her life had just shifted in a way she could never have anticipated. She wasn't sure where it would lead or what challenges they might face together. But for the first time, she felt something other than fear, hope. The city around them continued to pulse with life, unaware of the quiet, life-altering moment that had just taken place. And as Zara looked into Arian's eyes, she felt a connection, a sense of something more than coincidence. It wasn't just about a poor girl crashing into a CEO's luxury car anymore. It was about two people from different worlds finding something real in each other. Days turned into weeks, and their story continued to unfold, each moment more unexpected than the last. Zara's life slowly transformed as she and Arian spent time together, their connection growing deeper. She learned that despite their differences, they both carried scars. His from the weight of expectations and loneliness, hers from the battles of survival. Together, they discovered a new sense of belonging in each other as their worlds began to collide in the most beautiful, surprising way. And in the end, it wasn't about what they could give each other materially. It was about trust, vulnerability, and the courage to love beyond the boundaries they had set for themselves. Zara and Arian's story wasn't just a fairy tale. It was real, messy, and full of hope. And as they walked through life together, hand in hand, they both realized that sometimes the greatest blessings come from the most unexpected crashes.